All right, welcome back, guys. So in this video, I'm now going to talk about an experience I had with depression and anxiety and what I did to solve the problem, right, for me. I didn't feel the need to write anything on the board. I'm just going to kind of say everything off the top of my mind. What I will say is that this video is not meant to be medical advice, right? So you should always, if you suffer from any kind of mental problem, or if you suffer from depression or anxiety or think you may be, then you should seek a trained medical physician, right? I am not a trained medical physician. I don't have a license in any one of those fields, and you should seek them for help. What I'm going to say in this video is just what I did, right? For those who may be interested, I'm going to say what I did, and you take that for what it's worth. But it's not medical advice. You should seek a trained medical physician. So that's basically my disclaimer. So to just start things off, I was going through a very spiritual experience, right, some time ago, which I won't really talk about the spiritual aspect in this video. I'll probably talk about it in book 2, because in book 2, we'll actually cover the supernatural and spiritual phenomenon. But I'll try to keep this video just to really the depression and anxiety part, right? And what I did that I feel solved the problem. So I would say about 6 months, roughly. I think it's about 6 months. Is when I first started noticing it. I started when I would go to sleep, and I feel myself like drifting off. I would find myself breathe, like I would make a breathing sound, right? Which wasn't like super alarming, but it's just something I'd never done before. So when I would drift off, I would make this sound like, like I would just do that. And I'm like, what is that? When I first started noticing it, which I think was about 6 months before this experience happened, I was like, what is that? But it didn't really bother me. I still slept for what I thought was mostly fun. So I didn't really, just kind of ignored it. But it was something I hadn't done before. So I wasn't sure what was going on. But like I said, I just moved on. But later, so about 6 months after that, and I wasn't, clocking when I first noticed it, but I believe it's about 6 months from the time of this experience that I had. So I was almost done with the book, right? So I've been writing the book for roughly, at this time, I was roughly about 4.5 years. So it took me I was so ready to be done with this book, right? Been writing it for a very long time. Couldn't wait to sort of be finished with it and move on to something else. But then I still had to make these videos and still had to build a website. But I took off from work and I was just writing the book every day so I could finally be done with it, right? And what ended up happening, something happened, right? Like I said, it was kind of a spiritual experience, but something happened, and I found that I just could not sleep. I couldn't sleep at all, right? And it was crazy because I thought, well, I don't want to really, like I said, I don't want to go into the spiritual part of it, but I thought I was cursed. Let's just say that, right? I thought I was cursed and that I wasn't going to be able to sleep for all my days, right? But to keep going, I just could not sleep. And I remember the first 48 hours, right? The first 48, you know what I mean? I just was so tired, right? Because I couldn't sleep. And like I said, I thought I was cursed. I was never going to be able to sleep. And I was just delirious, right? I was walking around. I was trying to do everything I could to make myself more tired, and I just couldn't. Let me put that another way. I was exhausted, right? But I could not fall asleep, no matter how hard I tried, right? And eventually, I finally fell asleep, right? And I was so happy because I was like, oh, maybe I'm not cursed after all, right? And then when I fell asleep, and I was up for 2 days, right? Because I kept trying to go to sleep, but I couldn't. So it's like, I learned about something called sleep drive, right? So your sleep drive, I think I mentioned that in the book. I might have mentioned in the videos, but your sleep drive builds up throughout the day from the time you wake up, and then it kind of helps you fall asleep at night. if you keep trying to go to sleep early, it's like you use up your sleep drive. So now you got to build it more. And so because when this first happened, I kept trying to fall asleep. So I was using up all of my sleep drive. And combine that with the fact that I couldn't sleep at all is why I was up for like 2 days. Just delirious, struggling, exhausted. And I finally fell asleep. Then I woke up about 2 hours later, right after being awake for 2 days. So that wasn't nearly enough, right? But, so I would stay awake again, right? And I would keep doing this for like weeks, right? It was terrible. That was probably the hardest time of my life. Because what I learned from that experience, whenever I would go to sleep at the end of a day, which was always, the days for me were basically like a full 24 hours, I would realize when I would try to remember what I did the next day, the previous day, it always felt like 2 days ago, even though it was later that day, because I wasn't sleeping the whole day. I would sleep maybe for an hour and a half the whole day, and then that was it. And then I'd have to wait the whole day again before I can finally get another maybe 1 to 2 hours of sleep. And that was a crazy time. And not that this is super important, but what I learned from that experience is not being able to sleep is one of the worst problems you can have. Because if no matter what problem you're going through, right, as long as you can sleep, it's like you can recover and come back at that problem with more energy the next day. When you can't sleep, right, like think about the worst feelings you ever had. Imagine not being able to get sleep and kind of recover for that. It just gets worse and worse and doesn't stop, right? Like I said, that was one of the craziest times for me. And there was a lot more spiritual things going on that I'm going to talk about a little later. But just to get back into this, so that experience, I could not understand. Like I said, I thought I was cursed. So I wasn't really trying to solve the problem. And, I'm a theory guy, right? So I'm always trying to solve something in theory and trying to figure out, what the solution is. And I look at certain variables and I try to put everything together. So I wasn't using, I would say, a talent of mine in that circumstance because I was like, what's the point? But eventually, I would get certain messages. I was praying to God a lot. So I'd get certain messages and signs that I wasn't cursed, that this was something else. So I'm like, okay. And then I actually started using my mind, my sort of, I would say my talent, right, to solve problems, to put things into theory. And I started using it to try to figure out what's going on. And I would look up all these symptoms online and keep trying to figure out like what the issue is. And then eventually I looked up something called sleep apnea, right? Which I had never heard about in my life before that. And I was looking up these symptoms and I was like, that sounds like what I have, right? And eventually it turned out to be correct. And so I went to a sleep doctor and then he prescribed me everything that I needed. He basically got me there's something called a CPAP machine, it's also called an APAP machine if it auto adjusts the air pressure, which that's the one I have. And then the problem was solved and I was okay, right? But from that experience, right, I actually developed sleep disorder and anxiety and depression. So why did that happen? Well, when you have sleep apnea, there are two kinds, right? So there's, this has actually been a while since I looked this up. There's these, I forgot the names of them. There's sleep apnea when, I think it's, what is it called? When there's obstruction in your airway, right? And in your throat when you're breathing. I think like there's some type of flap that goes lower and it prevents you from breathing strongly when you're sleeping. And then the other kind occurs due to an issue with the signal coming from your brain, right? So there's nothing wrong necessarily with the passage or the volume of the airway that you're breathing through, but your brain just isn't sending the signal to breathe, which it's supposed to do when you go to sleep. Luckily, I didn't have that one. That one's much more of a problem. But I had the one where your throat kind of just falls too much, apparently. And so that one is much less of a problem compared to the other one, but it's still a huge problem. And when it's happening is when your body senses that you can't breathe a lot. So if your blood oxygen drops, your blood is flowing through your whole body and it passes through your brain. So when your brain reads that the blood oxygen, this is what I looked up. I believe this is correct. I didn't double check it before this video, but this is what I remember reading. your brain senses your blood oxygen is too low, and so what it actually does is it'll send, you'll feel like an adrenaline spike, right? It'll release more adrenaline so that your heart races, and then that heart racing causes you to breathe more, so it causes you to give a more powerful breathing effort, right? A stronger breathing effort, which gets more oxygen into your blood. And so, but that spike it causes you to wake up a little bit. Even if you don't wake up fully, right, so you're fully conscious again, it makes it much harder for you to stay in a deep sleep. And ultimately, in the end, it makes the quality of your sleep much less, right? So you wake up feeling exhausted and not strong or refreshed because you didn't really get a great sleep. It's way harder to remember your dreams if you dream at all, right? Because you're all constantly waking up from this drop in your oxygen and this adrenaline spike. But, so that kept happening to me when I was sleeping. And what it actually does, now me, right? So I'm always thinking of everything in terms of what's going on at the subconscious level or with the subconscious mind. So I'm applying this theory to this whole circumstance, right? What's going on, eventually when I at least figured out what was going on. Now during this time, let me actually just say this first. During this time, I kept feeling all of this anxiety. I felt this feeling of, now everyone who has anxiety disorder knows what I'm talking about, right? I felt this feeling of impending doom, right? Now I never felt that in my whole life, right? I've had anxiety, don't get me wrong, social anxiety and things like that, but that's completely different, right? That's just the anxiety I think everyone feels in certain circumstances. This was different, right? I felt the feeling of impending doom, like I was about to die. And I felt that all day. It didn't stop. It didn't go anywhere. It didn't matter where I was. I didn't have to be in some circumstance to finally feel it. I would just feel it nonstop. The only time I felt a little bit better was when I walked outside. So I would go for walks, right? Because I would get this fresh air. I didn't realize that it was actually the air outside, which I think made it easier for me to breathe, which was helping me. But this was before I kind of understood what was happening. I would feel this impending doom, and I would constantly go for walks, which it was hard to go for walks because I wasn't getting enough sleep to heal. So it would hurt to walk because my body wasn't healing from walking the previous day. But it was the only time I felt a little bit better. But yeah, so what I noticed happened is that I would feel this feeling of impending doom all day. I didn't feel like eating at all. So that's another thing I noticed. I actually lost 10 pounds because I just had no appetite. I didn't care. I was shocked at how I can go this long without eating and still have energy. I didn't even feel like eating a little tiny. It's like my need to eat was just gone. Didn't bother me, right? To not eat. I didn't feel weak from not eating. None of that. In fact, I always felt kind of anxious. And, that's from what I learned. I didn't know this before, but I think it's called your sympathetic nervous system, right? Which is responsible for, it's the part of your nervous system that's responsible for sort of making your body more excited, right? And releasing adrenaline and things like that. And there's another part of your brain that kind of prevents that part of your nervous system from becoming overactive, right? And I think mine became overactive from constantly, from the constant need to release adrenaline while I'm sleeping. So it gets super overactive, and that's why I feel impending doom all day, right? The body's not regulating it the way it should. And what it ultimately led to is me having really intense anxiety, right? It also led to depression and sleep disorder. So it was hard for me. It was, even when I got the machine, right, it was still hard to fall asleep. And I'll talk a little bit about that later for people who experience that problem. So because I had all these problems and all these feelings with my emotions, right? Now I'm a little bit different from, I guess, most people, right? Because I'm thinking of it now, and I'm thinking of obviously I want to solve these problems, right? They suck, right? They don't feel good, and I want to get out of this situation. So I'm thinking of everything that's going on in terms of this theory of the subconscious mind, since these are emotions, right? So if these emotions, and my theory is correct, there must be some way I can apply, or there must be some degree of application of what's going on, or an ability to explain it in terms of this theory of the subconscious mind, right? and I should be able to apply it to understand the solution to this problem, which is exactly what I did. So, during this time, I'm trying to analyze everything that's happened from this theory, and I'm like, well, actually, before I even go into the solution, let me just say, during this time, because I felt all of this impending doom, and I felt depression, which I've never even really felt depression before. I don't really have a depressed personality. It doesn't matter how many things I have that should make me upset in life and should give me a reason to feel depression. There have been many, right? But I just never had that personality. It's like, I just don't see the need or to feel I don't feel the need to feel depressed, right? Which depression isn't really something that comes from, I didn't know that before this experience. Depression is really something that comes from the body, right? And there's another place it comes from. We'll talk about that in the spiritual section. Depression can actually come from a spiritual attack, which we'll come and talk about that later. Which this, I believe, also is partially a spiritual attack on me, but not exactly. It's more to explain with it, which I'm not saying about the spiritual part of it. But for now, I thought depression was something that occurs when a person is just feeling really sad or something, which is what most people think who haven't gone through it, but it's not, right? When I went through it is when my eyes were really opened to what depression and anxiety really are. They're not just it's not a question of you just kind of, being down, right? You should think more positively. That's what everyone says, and that's even what I would have said before I had this experience. But then I was like, no, because I felt so empty, right? It's like depression is almost like the absence of emotion. You don't feel anything, right? And that's how I felt. The only emotion I really did kind of feel, though, was anxiety and impending doom. So that feeling was mixed with the feeling of not feeling almost anything outside of that emotion. And so I'm like, I think I'm depressed, right? So because I started to feel the symptoms I had felt similar to what other people ascribe to the state of being depressed, which, like I said, I never really had that, right? I did have it one other time, which again we'll talk about in book 2, but that was because of something I was doing. And I knew exactly what it was, but I never really had it when I wasn't doing anything like that, right? There was one time in my life where I was depressed when I was much younger. I was like almost suicidal. I wouldn't say I was suicidal. I didn't mind suicide. That's when I was so bored with life, right, that I didn't feel anything. But I was like not around people for like months, right? Not really interacting or socializing very much. But then I snapped out of it, right? So it was only that time and this other time I was doing this thing, which I'm going to talk about later, that made me depressed. But outside of that, I'm not really a depressed person. Never really had that experience like that outside of those 2 times. But so when I had this experience, I'm like, I had these symptoms. I was like, I think this is depression. I think this is what they're talking about, right? And so when I noticed, now I'm a guy who knows everything. I literally wrote the book, right, on the subconscious mind. I know subconscious energy like the back of my hand, right? So I should be able to charge energy and feel a whole bunch of emotion. At least you would think, right? So that's what I thought was going to be the case. And it definitely did not work that way. So in spite of everything I've told you about, right, when I had depression and anxiety, what I noticed was that I could not charge energy to save my life, right? It was so hard, right? It was so much harder to charge energy than normal. Now, because I actually know how the subconscious works, I've been charging it for years before this experience, I know how it's supposed to charge. I know how quickly it's supposed to charge. I know how much it's supposed to flow. I know all of that. And during this experience, I could clearly see my subconscious wasn't moving the way it should. It's kind of like, if you think of water, right? Water will flow, right, in a container, right, very easily. But if let's say you start to freeze it a little bit, but it's not frozen all the way, it's going to flow very much more slowly, right? It's much more viscous, is that the right word? Viscous, I think. Has much more viscosity, right? And it doesn't flow as much, right? That's how my subconscious started to feel. And I could tell when I'm trying to control it, I'm like, oh, I'll just charge energy to feel better, to get out of this emotional sort of hole I'm in. And when I would try to charge it, it would like charge very weakly, right? So the things I'm doing, I'm noticing isn't working. So all of the things we talked about, right? It doesn't quite work as well when you have depression and anxiety. This is why people who have these symptoms don't experience motion the way most people do, right? And so, which again, most people don't really know that, but at least for me, because I think of everything in terms of the subconscious, I was able to pick up on this, right? Like I'm like, my emotions aren't, my subconscious isn't doing nearly what it should, right? And forget charging creativity. There was no chance I was gonna be able to charge that and get it to organize and things like that. So my creativity dropped, right? Not that was probably the least important thing, but it was something I noticed, right? And I'm like, why isn't my subconscious not charging as much? And another thing I noticed, which is also interesting, is remember I said that you can go into a deeper transcendental state level. Well, this time I noticed that I not only could I not enter a deeper transcendental state, I couldn't even go into a light transcendental state. Well, I could go in a light transcendental state, but not to the way I normally could, right? So if I had to put numbers to it, let's put it this way. Let's give it a level of depth, right? So let's just say to use the term units, right? So I could, a normal transcendental state, which like I said is like giving 70% attention, 30% is on monitoring thoughts. You would go, like let's say 1 unit into a transcendental state. In a very deep transcendental state, where you give 100% of your attention, is about 2 units deep. What I felt like is I was going only half a unit deep, right? I could not get it lower, right? Now this is just my assessment. Obviously I'm not using an instrument to measure anything, but I could feel that I wasn't even going to the normal light level of transcendental, into a transcendental state. By the way, that's why when you have depression, anxiety, it's harder to charge emotion because you can't go deeper into transcendental state. So remember, the deeper you go, the more powerfully you can charge emotion. And because I can only go about halfway into a light state, my ability to charge emotion was much weaker than normal. So it charges much more slowly. That's why people in this state barely can feel any emotion, right? So I noticed that. I'm like, why can't I go to a lower state? So I did everything I told you guys about. I held an intention, waited till I entered a transcendental state, and then in a transcendental state, tried to use my instinct to express emotion. I told some story in my mind. I kept repeating it over and over and over again to charge energy. But it would not charge quick. It would barely charge at all, but it wouldn't really charge quickly, right? I could feel it. I can tell. And I'm like, I'm barely in a transcendental state. Nothing is going as smoothly as it used to. Right, and it happened because of this stupid anxiety and depression. And so I'm like, how do I solve this problem? Now, here's the thing though. I know that my subconscious mind is metaphysical. Nothing changes with it, right? It's completely, what's the word I'm looking for? Its functionality can't be damaged because it's actually metaphysical. It's part of your spirit, right? The body can mess up in all kinds of ways. So I assume this issue is coming from my body, right? But I actually had a spiritual dream which kind of confirmed that. The first night that I finally got a tiny bit of sleep, but it was only like 15 seconds, right? No, 15 minutes. So then I woke back up. But in a short time, I had a dream which kind of confirmed that it wasn't from my spirit, because that's what I was thinking at the time. So I figured it was coming from my body, right? And I'm like, how do I solve this problem? Because I can't charge the way I normally would. Never had a problem with anxiety and depression of this kind. So my doctor, I told him about it. And at the time, I told him that I had these symptoms, but I just went to sleep. Like, I didn't care about anything. I'm like, I don't care how bad I feel, how much, I don't care about none of that. I just want to get some sleep, right? So he prescribed the APAP machine for me, but he also, before I got the machine, and I was telling him about these symptoms, he gave me, because I had to schedule a sleep test first. So in the meantime, when you do the sleep test, if you have sleep apnea, then you get the machine, because the machine is regulated, so you can't just buy it, which was so annoying because I was pretty sure I had it and I just wanted to get it. I'm willing to deal with the consequences if for some reason I don't really have it, but they don't let you do that. So you have to go to a sleep doctor, schedule a test, pay for everything, right? And so for the first appointment, I was telling him these symptoms, and he was like, okay, I'm gonna give you a prescription. So he prescribed something called Trazodone, right? And the first night I took it, right, I was like, okay, I was just hoping it was going to help me sleep. But what it did is it did kind of help me sleep, but it helped me sleep a little too much. In other words, what happened was when I took it, I did feel calmer, right? So my depression it didn't feel as strong. I'm like, oh, this is good. But like I said, what I really wanted was to sleep, and I did end up falling asleep. But here's the problem, right? When I was dreaming, any dream, I felt like I was choking. You know what I mean? Which didn't happen before, right? Even though I could barely sleep at all. But when I did sleep, I didn't necessarily feel like I was choking. Sometimes I would wake up like gasping for air, but it never quite got to the point where I felt like I was choking. But when I took that, I felt like I was actually choking inside the dream, and then I woke up choking. I was coughing. And I think that was because the trazodone had relaxed me so much that my adrenaline wasn't giving as strong an effort, right, to help me breathe. Like, there's a reason your body does that, and it wasn't doing it as much, which just resulted in me choking. Now, the doctor said, no, that wasn't from trazodone, but I think it was. And I'm not putting it on him, right? I knew that might happen. I knew there was a chance that could happen, but I wanted to see. He gave me a dosage that he felt like, we'll try this with you first. So I took it that one time, and because it was causing me to choke, I just didn't take any more. But, and then eventually I got the machine. But that was a rough week for me. My heart was hurting because I was constantly beating. I had to wait about a week before I got the machine. By the way, when I took the sleep test, he said I had severe sleep apnea, which was like almost the worst. It's different scales, like mild, moderate, severe. And I had severe, like the worst kind you could have, right? And so then I got the machine. Then I started sleeping better, but I still had the anxiety problem. I still had depression. And I still had sleep disorder. So I still had trouble sleeping. And I'll explain where that comes from in a moment from a subconscious perspective, because some people do suffer from sleep disorder, even though it's not all of this, right? There's something they're doing consciously that's preventing themselves from sleeping, with a doctor can't really fix. You just have to do the work of controlling and charging your subconscious properly. But, so to get into it, right, once I got the machine and I started getting a little more sleep and I started feeling a little bit better, the problem of depression and anxiety didn't really go away. That was still there. And I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, there was two solutions I could do to solve this problem that I could use. I could go the route of pills, right? But I knew, especially from that trazodone experience, that pills, I could use them, but I didn't want to really go that route, because the problem with that is that the emotions, like I said, comes from your subconscious mind. Your subconscious mind has two commanders. It has a commander of your mind and as a commander of your body. When you try to solve a problem like that by taking pills, what you're trying to do is go the route of the body. So you're trying to get your body to change the way it commands your subconscious so that it's no longer depressed. You could do that, however, you're not going to account for the stuff the mind is doing, right? And the body is not, you want to be very careful with how you use the body to change the way it commands the subconscious, because all of those commands are also tied into how the brain regulates your body. So it's very dangerous, right, to just start using it to just change the way it commands your subconscious, which is what drugs do. And so I'm like, if I had the idea, right, and then I think I'll finally get into it. So I had this idea. I'm like, okay, although all this time I could use my subconscious in a slightly different way, I didn't want to, because I wanted to solve all the problems through the body first, right? Because if you start charging your subconscious in a way that changes the body to solve a problem, right, that could be very dangerous if the body is not getting something fundamental that it needs, right? You have this disease because the body isn't doing something right or isn't getting some nutrient that it needs, right? So, for example, if, let's say, like sailors at sea, right? So everyone knows the story. Sailors at sea would develop scurvy, right? And they wouldn't know why they were getting it. And then when they started eating, I think it was oranges or something, they noticed they felt better. What they were missing was vitamin C, right? And if you start trying to stop or take something to prevent symptoms of a disease or reduce inflammation and you feel better without actually solving the problem, right, the problem is eventually just going to get worse and you'll eventually just die, even if you've managed to reduce the symptoms and make them worse, right? So you don't want to try to solve a problem just by taking the negative symptoms away, right? The negative symptoms are there for a reason. You want to find out what's causing the problem first and then solve that, and then you can worry about the symptoms. So in this case, I didn't want to charge my energy in a way that changed my body, because I knew that's what happens. At least that's my theory. First, I wanted to solve all the problems through the body first. And then when I felt I'd finally done that, I was like, okay, I'm going to do something different, because it was so hard to charge energy and still sleep the way I normally slept. So I was like, okay, and I felt so depressed, right? And I had so much anxiety. I felt miserable during this time because I couldn't charge energy, and I felt depression and this sense of doom every day. But I was like, okay, if my subconscious simply won't charge, and I know it's not coming from my mind, right, then it must be coming from my body. My body must be responsible for charging my subconscious in a way that's keeping it in this sort of state of anxiety. You could say frequency of anxiety and depression. So I'm like, you know what I'm going to do? This is a grand idea I had at the time, because I'd never done this before. I was like, I'm going to just keep charging a particular frequency. I'm going to focus on a specific subject, and I'm going to just keep charging it over and over and over, because I couldn't go into a deeper transcendental state, so I couldn't get much charging power. But I'm like, but I can still get a little charging power. So I'm like, I'm going to keep charging more, and however tiny that amount of charging power is, I'm going to keep using it. I'm going to keep charging more and more and more and more and more. And every day I'm going to just keep charging some particular positive memory or some frequency. And the idea, the goal, and this was my theory at the time, which I didn't know if it was going to work, which eventually it did, but I was like, if my theory is correct, then what should be possible, right, is that I should be able to charge a subconscious memory or make it so positive that it becomes so powerful, right, that it starts to overpower my body's command to feel anxiety and anxiousness. Because this is what happens, and everyone who's had anxiety and depression knows what I'm talking about. What happens is you keep feeling an urge to feel depressed. You keep feeling an urge to think like a depressed person, which feels like you don't have motivation. Every time you try to do something that makes you a little bit motivated, you're going to feel like, oh, well, this is not going to do anything. This is not going to help me, or this is pointless, right? What that really is your subconscious compelling you or trying to alter your perception to perceive everything as meaningless, right? That's the depression frequency. And when you have anxiety, your subconscious is compelling you to perceive something as threatening to you, and it makes you feel a sense of doom if you do this. Now, on the conscious level, you know that's not the case, but you can't help it. Your subconscious is charged at that frequency. So people who have depression, no matter what they do, they just don't feel any emotion, and they feel like it doesn't matter and that there's no purpose. They know there is, but it doesn't matter, right? No matter how hard they try, they don't feel purpose in it. It feels like there's no point, and they have no motivation for anything. That's the depression frequency. So the perception is altered to see that, and they feel that. And people who have anxiety disorder, they'll a lot of times feel like they're going to die off the simplest things. And doctors will tell them nothing's going to happen, you're perfectly fine, but they can't help it, right? Because their subconscious is charged at the anxiety frequency. And so what I recognized is my subconscious kept compelling me to have these thoughts. And I'm like, I know that if I give into these thoughts, so remember what I talked about in chapter 4 about, what did I call it? Mental activation and something takeover, something like that, right? Where your body, when it charges your subconscious in a certain way, it'll cause your mind to kind of take over the charge. And I knew that I was doing this. I knew mentally I kept taking over the charge and charging anxiety and charging depression more whenever I would give in to the urge to think this way from my subconscious. And I knew that urge was coming from my body. So I'm like, one, I have to resist that urge. Otherwise, if I give into it, it's just going to keep charging. But I'm like, I'm going to charge a single frequency so powerfully, right, that eventually, and just to kind of do a diagram, if let's kind of model a positive memory, right? So this is and this is super random, but this is kind of like think of this as like showing how much charge is in my subconscious short-term memory for depression and anxiety. All right, and this is how much charge is in my short-term memory for, I forget which frequency I did. I don't remember. I think it was peace or something, but or just happiness or joy or a feeling of healing. I think it was peace though. It was inner peace, relaxation. So let's say this is how much energy is in my short-term memory for peace, right? So this is what my mind is, what I'm trying to charge. This is also charged from my mind too, but it's mostly charged by the body. But so you can see this is going to compel me way stronger and way more powerfully than this. So what I got the idea to do was I'm going to keep, at first, I should actually say this first. What I first did is I kept trying to charge different frequencies, right? And none of them, they would charge a little bit, but they weren't charging fast enough. None of them would get a lot of charging power. Then this would just keep overpowering them so much, right? So they would, whenever I would stop thinking about it, they would start to lose energy and discharge, and then I'd be back here again. And so it wouldn't work. And I'm like, man, this is tough. Like, this is a hard charging problem that I never had before. I never had trouble charging energy or going to a deeper transcendental state. So I'm like, you know what? When that wouldn't work, when I noticed it wasn't working, charging all these different frequencies, I got the bright idea of like, no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to charge a single frequency, and I'm just going to keep focusing on that one frequency or that one memory so that it doesn't lose power. Because if I keep charging all these different frequencies, the moment I stop charging one, it starts to discharge. And when I focus on another and start charging it, and then switch to another, that one starts to discharge. And because they're charging so slowly, right, they all discharge, they just kept discharging so much energy that it was just too hard to keep charging all of them to stand up to this guy. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to pick one, and even though it's going to start very small, I'm going to just keep charging it. I'm going to charge it more and more and more, day after day, right? And then eventually it would kind of look like this, and this is a little different size here, but it would look like this, and then eventually it'd be more like this. So as I, probably after like 3 or 4 days, I just keep charging the inner peace frequency. So now my short-term memory is filling up with more peace, and I feel it in my mood, right? And so then it's like this. So my anxiety and depression is still very, very strong. It's still compelling me, but now it's not compelling me as much. And so day after day, I keep charging that one frequency. Then eventually it's kind of like this, right? So now it's mostly even, finally. So this was probably after about 2 weeks, right? I would just keep charging that single frequency. And I'll talk about how to do that, even though we already talked about charging, but I'm going to talk about how I did that in a moment. But I just kept charging that single frequency, and now my mood finally is starting to change. Although I still feel depression, anxiety, now I actually feel peace. I don't feel as bad anymore. And now I'm starting to finally feel better. And then, as I keep charging depression, anxiety more and more, now it's starting to reverse itself, right? Excuse me, as I keep charging and feeling inner peace more, now it's starting to reverse itself. So now the peace is getting stronger. And then eventually, the roles are reversed. Actually, yeah, let me make that. Well, let me just use that. So now it's like this, right? So now the feeling of peace is much stronger, and the feeling of depression, anxiety is much weaker. Until eventually it just got so weak that it disappeared, right? And so this was how I solved the problem, right? And when it got here, right, now I mostly feel peace. So now my subconscious finally feels free again. Now I'm starting to feel more emotion. I'm starting to go in the transcendental state easier. My subconscious is flowing the way it's supposed to, right? And the feeling of depression, anxiety is almost not even there anymore. And then, like I said, eventually it was just gone. Right, so that was how I solved the depression problem. So what did I do ultimately what was my theory that I expected to result in this behavior? Well, remember what I said. If you have a prolonged charge, it starts to actually change the body, right? Because the subconscious compels the mind. Even though it compels the mind, it also compels your body, right? It's like a, kind of like Newton's third law. For every action is the opposite of the equal reaction. Right, so if I touch this, if I touch this board, it exerts a force back on me. When I send a command to my subconscious sends a compulsion back to my conscious mind. When your body sends a command to your subconscious sends a compulsion back to the body. And you can send the intention to your subconscious to cause a compulsion on your conscious mind, but it'll also still cause a compulsion on your body. So I figured that if my brain, right, is constantly sending commands to my subconscious to charge depression and anxiety, then it should be possible for me to send commands to my subconscious in such a way that it'll compel my body to to change in a way that reflects the frequency I'm trying to charge. So if I want to charge the frequency of inner peace, my body it can't have a sort of, how do I want to word it? It can't have a state or neurological state or regulatory state where it's constantly charging depression and anxiety, right? Because that would go against the compulsion that my subconscious is trying to compel it toward, right? So if I constantly charge the feeling of inner peace, my subconscious compels my body, according to inner peace frequency, my body will change in a way that allows me to feel inner peace more, right? That's the compulsion. So it's changing to sort of facilitate the frequency of the compulsion my subconscious is compelling it on. So like I said, it can't be in a state of charging of depression and anxiety if it's going to allow my subconscious to have an easier time charging and feeling of peace. So that compulsion, that'll make a little more sense when we talk about chi energy in chapter 8. But so I knew that my body was going to change if I could just keep charging this singular frequency. Or that was my theory, I should say. It should change in the direction of the frequency if I just keep charging it. But initially, I could never get the charge powerful enough to expect any significant change in my body. So I decided I was going to pick one memory and one frequency to just keep charging, no matter what, right? And if I'm correct, my mind should be able to eventually charge it powerfully enough, right? To overpower my body, and then my body would start to have to listen or capitulate, right? Because it's getting overpowered. It's going to start to have to change in the direction of the charge from my mind, which means it's changing to charge less and less and less anxiety and depression. And like I said, that's exactly what happened. So to get back to, and I'll talk about the solution, but the problem that I feel, right? I'm not a medical scientist. Don't listen to me as for medical advice. But this is my personal opinion and how I treated it for myself, is that in medical science, what they do is they constantly give people pills, right, to solve these problems. The problem with the pill is that it's not going to compensate for the mental work. Now, to be fair, when they talk about depression and anxiety, they do talk about changing the way you think and changing your behaviors. But that's not going to work for everybody because they don't know about these principles with charging the subconscious. So it's like a wild card. Some people might, if they get a pill, right, the pill is going to prevent the body from charging it depression and anxiety as much. So it might go to this just from taking a pill. But it's still compelling you to think depression and anxiety this much. So if your mind is not, I don't want to use the word strong enough, but if you have too much of a habit of thinking in terms of anxiety and depression, like just going along with what your subconscious is compelling you to do, then you might just charge it again. You might still charge it even though your subconscious is here. So now if you keep charging with the mind, even with the pills, it goes to this, right? And then if you still keep thinking, going along with your, I should say, when it gets to this, you may go to a doctor and say it's getting worse. And the doctor gives you a larger dosage. So now it goes back to this with that dosage. But if your mind keeps giving into the compulsion, right, you don't have to, but if you keeps giving into the compulsion, then it'll just go back to this. And so then you tell the doctor, well, with this bigger dosage, it worked at first. So for a little while, I felt really good, but now it feels worse again. And then this cycle continues until the doctor can no longer give you a larger dosage, and then you're just kind of stuck, right? And this happens to people sometimes. Now, some people, once it gets here, it'll start here, the doctor will give them some medication, and then it goes to this. And then that has given their minds enough freedom, enough of that chokehold is not on their mind as much, and they have enough freedom where they can do exactly what I did. They start thinking more positively, right, and they start charging a positive frequency. Then it overpowers the body, and then they can finally get out, right, which is what I did. But not everyone does that, right? There's no way you can control a person's conscious mind to prevent them from doing that, which is why pills don't always solve the depression problem. But more specifically, doctors, they do recognize that changing the way you think is important, but it would be nice, right, if they can explain it in these terms so a person knows exactly what's going on. Because when I was doing this, right, I kept feeling, actually, let me put it another way. This is what happens to people who get depressed and who are stuck in a depression. It's almost like a hole you got to climb out of. So when their body, now I had it to sleep anxiety, right? I had it from sleep apnea. But some people have it from different things. And so what happens is the body will start charging one of these two things, or sometimes both, and then it'll compel their mind to produce an intention to take over the charge. Now the mind can resist that urge and think of positive intention instead, or it can give in to the urge, right? And so if it gives in to the urge, it takes over the charge, and now their body's charging depression and anxiety. Now, when they start charging it through their mind, the subconscious compels the body more to change in a way that allows it to charge at that frequency more, the frequency of anxiety and depression. So the body will change even more. It'll become like this because your mind's taking over the charge and you're charging it the frequency of anxiety and depression. So the sort of nerve system in your brain will change in a way that makes you feel more anxiety and depression. But now it's compelling your subconscious even more to compel your mind to think thoughts of depression and anxiety. And if you give in to that urge, then the mind makes the charge even more powerful. And so you keep getting this. Your body charges more and more and more, or changes more and more and more, as your mind keeps charging it because it's giving into the urge. So what happens is it's basically a feedback loop. And you can fall into a hole like this, right? If you keep giving, this is you, right? So if you keep giving into this urge from your body to think a thought of depression and charge that at frequency, then your body will keep changing as a result of you charging that frequency with your mind. And then it'll compel you even more strongly to charge that frequency. And if you keep giving into the urge, then it's a complete feedback loop. And your body changes more and more and more and more. And the depression and anxiety gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So the key to getting out of this, what I believed for me, was that if I keep charging some frequency, no matter how small it starts off at, if I keep charging it more and more and more and resisting all these compulsions and urges I feel to think in a depressed way, feel anxiety, give in to this feeling to think life doesn't matter, give into this feeling to think that you're doomed. And I'm like, no, even though I'd feel the urge in my mind, I'm not going to think it, right? Because I don't want to charge it. So I wouldn't focus on anything that would cause that feeling, whatever positive memory, to switch to active state. I could feel it, but I wouldn't think anything that made me feel that emotion more. I would just focus on things that made me feel this one frequency, right? Even though negative memory wasn't a big deal to worry about here, because I had felt so much depression and anxiety. Like I said, I'll talk about the technique in a minute, but I kept resisting the urge and just focusing on charging one frequency no matter what. And then I started to climb out the hole more and more and more. Some people, when they get in this hole, they could stay there for years. I've read stories about people who had depression for like 10 years. Some of them have it their whole lives, or the rest of their lives once they develop it. Because it's a hole, right? You have to do crazy amounts of charging. You have to charge, you start off very small, and you have to keep charging so you can get out of the hole and overpower the charge coming from your body and change your body's nervous system so it stops doing that, right? And if you don't go through the work of charging little by little by little by little, day after day after day, that, like, for me, I think it's best to just do it a single frequency. You only need one positive frequency. Then the body changes and that charge gets weaker from the body. But it is a hole you have to get out of. Pills will help you. A pill might help you to climb this much out the hole. Now, if it's not that bad, you can basically just get out. But if you have it really bad, a pill might get you here, but the mind still has to do the rest of the work, right? And if you're like me, you just understand these principles. Like, I didn't use pills at all. I just did all the charging from my mind and got out. So yeah, that's basically. I didn't really plan this video. Kind of went longer than I thought, but yeah, this is my theory of how depression and anxiety works, right? You can charge out of it through the mind. But this is ultimately why people who have depression and anxiety, why they just have so much trouble feeling emotion, right? Or feeling emotion other than anxiety. Or if they just have depression, they don't feel anything. You know what I mean? It's so hard for them to feel emotion. And that's because they're in this hole. It's like they have a super deep charge of the anxiety frequency. So it's dampening their ability to feel any emotion, any other emotion, and they can't even enter a deeper transcendental state. Charge emotion very strongly anyway. So it's like they just feel no emotion, and anything that does make them feel a tiny bit of emotion, it's too weak to really be worth it. So, to now finally get into the solution, right? So which we did go over the solution, but just to be a little more specific, what I would do is I would pick a specific subject, right? I would pick a specific frequency and a specific subject. So I would just tell some story in my mind. Like I said, I believe it was the inner peace frequency. So I did multiple frequencies at first, so it's a little hard for me to remember, but I believe it was the inner peace frequency. And I would continuously listen to these inner peace songs, just feelings of happiness and joy. And sometimes I would, did I pre-charge it? I think I pre-charged it a little bit in the beginning, but it was just not, it was like I didn't even really, I'm trying to remember, because I know I pre-charged some frequencies, because the pre-charging still worked. But I just didn't feel pre-charging was, because it's only like 10 seconds, so I didn't feel like it was powerful enough. So I kept main charging, and I kept listening to different songs that relaxed me, and I would meditate, and get into like meditation position, and I would just keep telling a story in my mind about peace, like inner peace, and I would keep charging to focus on the feeling of peace. I'm trying to remember. I did peace, but I also did just... Excuse me, I did peace, but I also did a general feeling of happiness. Actually, I think it might have been the happiness frequency. But, yeah, it was one of them, right? It was kind of a blur, because like I said, it was super hard to, it was even hard to remember things around that time because I had so much trouble sleeping. Which I'm going to talk about that also. But yeah, I picked a frequency. Actually, now I think it was the happiness frequency. But I know I did inner peace. I might have did both of them. But, I just kept charging and listening to music, and I kept charging whatever frequency I picked. I think, like I said, now I think it's the happiness frequency. I just kept charging it day after day, and I charge it, like I said, in short sessions. So your body favors intermittent charging sessions. So I would do it for very short amounts of times, and I would keep charging it. Now, ideally, like I said, you want to do it for a couple minutes. Some negative memory will develop, but at this time I wasn't worried about negative memory that much because I was so in the hole, right, with these charges from my body that it wasn't super consequential. I just needed a little bit of negative memory to develop. So I kept charging in intermittent sessions, right, and charging these frequencies. Now, at first, I didn't really feel much, as you would expect. And this is why most people give up, right? When they're have depression and anxiety, they'll try to do something that makes them feel a little bit of emotion, and they're like, this isn't working, I'll stop. Don't do that, right? Because it's actually building up. It might not feel like it right now, but it is building. So what I did is I kept charging that same frequency day after day after day in intermittent charging sessions. Because I knew, in theory, it should be growing in my short-term memory. Then eventually it was going to overtake the charge from my body, and eventually it was going to get so large that I was going to start compelling my body to change in a way that allows me to charge that frequency more easily, which means it has to stop charging the depression and anxiety frequency. So I just kept doing that day after day after day. Throughout the day, in little short few-minute charging sessions, listening to music, telling some story in my mind. And then I could feel it day after day after day. I started to feel better, right? I started to feel better. The depression and anxiety frequency wasn't feeling as strong. And then it started to actually go away. And it was about a month. So I did this for about 1 month before it felt like it was just completely gone. Right, so my body was just no longer charging depression and anxiety, and by that time, I presume my body's brain chemistry had actually changed, right, to stop charging those frequencies because it changed in the direction of charging the feeling of happiness and inner peace. So yeah, that's ultimately the solution that I feel. This was so much more long-winded than I wanted it to be. But that was the solution. That was how I personally feel that I solved this problem of depression and anxiety. You know what I mean? And so yeah, if this, I still have to talk about sleep disorder. Let me talk about sleep disorder a little bit. So for sleep disorder, when I kept going to sleep, right? This is for people who are curious as to how I also solve sleep disorder. When sleep disorder is basically when you just have trouble sleeping. When you're falling asleep, right? At least when I was falling asleep during this time, my heart kept jolting, right? I would drift off to sleep and my heart would jolt, right? And it would wake me back up. So it was so hard to fall asleep because that kept happening, right? As soon as I drift off, my heart it's like it starts beating super faster, like it's panicking, right? Which was the anxiety. Then I would wake back up again, and then the cycle would repeat itself, and it was so hard to sleep. But what also ends up happening now, that doesn't have to happen from sleep apnea. So I've actually read, because at first I thought I had that, and I read these stories of people who have that problem. And they have a really hard time too. So I'm kind of going to go over, I had that a little bit after this, but that wasn't as hard to solve because my body wasn't doing wasn't as much of a problem. But what happens with that is the activity of sleeping, right? That's still an activity to your subconscious. So your subconscious, it switches to a certain frequency when you're sleeping, and the subconscious instinct starts expressing itself at that frequency. So normally, you could call it the sleep frequency, right? So your body is the one that charges the sleep frequency. It reduces the charge of the ground state on that frequency, and your subconscious expresses itself in a way that kind of allows you to drift off to sleep, right? If you try to catch yourself sleeping, you're actually charging your subconscious needs to be in the ground state to compel you to observe yourself like that, right? That uses your negative mind. That's why trying to sleep, in order to sleep, your mind has to drift, right? That's why trying to catch yourself sleeping actually prevents you from sleeping. But what will happen is most of us, when we go to sleep, our subconscious has such a powerful charge at the sleep frequency that it's strong enough to compel you to just drift off no matter what you're doing, usually. But it is possible to disrupt that charge. So if you keep going to sleep but not actually sleeping, you're changing the charge at that particular subconscious memory, right? So the subconscious memory that holds the charge or carries the charge for you sleeping, you start to change the frequency stored in that memory. So now now when you go to sleep, your subconscious recognizes this activity. It's associating that activity with all different other types of frequencies that aren't sleeping. So now you have trouble sleeping. So that causes sleep disorder. And that's a very debilitating problem, right? Because it's so much harder to sleep because your drive to sleep isn't as strong. And the problem with that drive isn't necessarily coming from the body. It's coming from the way your subconscious is charged, right? So when I had that too, and that was a lot easier to solve, like I said, because I knew what was going on. So I was like, okay, whenever I'd go to sleep, I would feel this urge. Because during this time when I had so much trouble sleeping, I kept wanting to sleep so badly, right? So every time I'd fall asleep, I would keep having this anxious thoughts about, am I sleeping? Am I sleeping? Am I going to fall asleep? Is this going to work, right? But you don't want those thoughts to be associated with the activity of sleeping because you're going to keep watching yourself sleep. And your subconscious is going to charge to keep watching yourself sleep during the activity of sleeping. And so, like I said, that results in sleep disorder, which is what I had. And so when I got the CPAP machine or the APAP machine, what I started doing is every time I felt that urge to kind of watch myself sleep and feel anxious and think about it, because that was what was stored in the positive memory, the subconscious memory associated with that activity, I would resist it, right? And I would just keep resisting that urge to think about it and watch myself and all that. And then I would eventually fall asleep. In some cases, when this was first happening, I would pre-charge it. So I would sleep. I would try to sleep for about 10 seconds, right? And then I would stop, right? Because during this time, I was staying up for almost 24 hours, right? So I would try to sleep for about 10 seconds and stop. And I'd try to sleep for about 10 seconds. And I was pre-charging the subconscious memory associated with sleeping, just to sleep. And then it was kind of charging up again. But when I got the APAP machine, I could have done that, but I didn't feel the need to. I just kept, I still slept in very short sessions, but then I would stop because it was like an intermittent charge, right? Or like I said, charging favors intermittency. So I'd do it for like a few minutes, really maybe like a minute, and then I would stop, right? I would just lay down, rest my eyes, and try to sleep for like a few minutes. Make sure I didn't think about watching myself sleep or have these anxious thoughts, am I going to sleep? I wouldn't do any of that and then stop. Because each time I do that, now I'm charging the sleep frequency. And when I do finally try to fall asleep, which I would wait like all day, right, so I could develop sleep drive, which that does come from the body. and then I would finally try to go to sleep. But now, when I am falling asleep, I would just resist any urge that I have, any compulsion to think anxious thoughts. You have to resist it, because that's hard, because no doctor can do that for you. Nobody can do the work for you. You have to be the one to resist the urge. And when you resist that urge to kind of watch yourself sleep, it doesn't matter what you think. Just don't watch yourself sleep. Just ignore the urge to do that. Think anything. And I know how not statements work, so I wasn't trying to focus on the thing I didn't want to do, because I know that was going to cause my subconscious to charge as if I was focusing on it. So I would just make an effort to not think sleeping, not to watch myself sleep. And then after a couple nights, like my subconscious started to charge properly at the sleep frequency. All those other thoughts discharged and aged out of short-term memory, and I could sleep normally again. So that was how I solved my sleep anxiety disorder. So, like I said, this video went on way too long, but I just wanted to really talk about because this was my experience. I wanted to talk about those things about sleep disorder, anxiety, and depression, because I know a lot of people suffer from that, right? And in my opinion, again, I'm not a trained medical doctor, so don't take my advice as medical advice, or don't take what I'm saying as medical advice. But my opinion is that doctors, the problem with the scientific community as it relates to mental health is that they keep thinking metaphysics isn't real and there's nothing supernatural, and so they let me put it this way. You can pretend that there's no metaphysics. You can pretend that there's nothing supernatural, no problem. But that doesn't make it not real, right? That doesn't make it true. If you pretend that it doesn't exist, that's just going to be a problem for you. Like, you're just going to be the one at a disadvantage from that, right? And I'm going to talk again about this, because this is another problem I talk about when it comes to spiritual attacks, right? We're going to talk about that in book 2. Which, like I said, I think we'll start next video. But in the scientific community, there's all these problems that they have because they keep thinking that they can't appeal to supernatural concepts or metaphysics, and people suffer from that, is my opinion. Because I studied all this stuff for years, right? Developing this theory, performing tests, performing experiment over and over and over and over and over again, trying to perfect the theory and make it more structured and answer all these little questions that I had that I didn't feel the current theory I had at the time quite answered. So I'm the one who put in the work, right, to formulate this theory. When someone comes to a doctor, they're not expected to know medical science. They're not expected to know all this stuff. The doctor's expected to know that and to teach them what they need to do, give them advice, and prescribe things as needed. They should be telling them about this stuff, right? But because they keep pretending there's no such thing as the supernatural or metaphysical, people suffer because you have this kind of closed-minded way of thinking. And so, I just feel that's important to say some of these things, right? Again, this is just my opinion and what I did to solve this problem, because I could have went to a doctor, which I did actually, and I could have taken the pills he gave me, the trazodone, and I could have keep using them, and if they didn't work, I could have got a higher dosage, but no. Right? I felt like, I had the power to just change it myself by controlling my subconscious energy, right? And so I just think it's important to kind of talk about this stuff, right? So if you suffer from anxiety and depression, right, and, and you have for years, just remember, especially for the people who have for years, just recognize that everything we really talked about for the subconscious it's going to be much harder for you. It still applies. But it's going to be much harder for you to charge it, right? Because of what your body is doing, right? Most people's body doesn't charge their subconscious. It doesn't charge their subconscious in that way. And so, use these. Well, I'm not saying to use these ideas. You go to a doctor, but for me, when I use these ideas and I use these principles, I finally got out of it, right? But I would hope these ideas did get into medical science and they accepted them, so that they could help people. Right now, I'm just one person. Maybe this doesn't help. Other people are different. I don't know. You would have to have multiple people sort of take this approach and see if it works like it did for me. But that should be done under controlled conditions or with monitoring by a doctor. So I feel like I could have explained that better. Like I said, I didn't have notes. I just kind of said off the top of my head. However, if it wasn't super clear, then I recommend you rewatch the video. And hopefully, it makes sense. But, so yeah, I think that's pretty much it for book 1. So we're pretty much done with that. In book 2, the next video, we're now going to move on to book 2, which, like I said, for me, it's still kind of one book. I just split it because when the first book was too big. If I tried to include everything, it was too big. So we're going to move on to, originally it was just chapter 15, but now we're going to move on to chapter 1 of book 2. So now we're going to start talking about everything about the subconscious mind as it relates to these more supernatural and metaphysical aspects of reality, right? Which is, like I said, that's a whole other animal, which is why it's a whole other book. In all of the metaphysics pretty much revolves around God, right? So we're going to start talking a lot about God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit. We're going to talk about all that stuff. Now, we're going to get into talking about all that, right? So, yeah, that's it for now, though, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.